Grace Williams stood at the altar in her pristine white dress, the silence crushing her as 300 wedding guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The church doors had slammed shut 20 minutes ago when her maid of honor burst through them, tears streaming down her face, to deliver the news that would shatter Grace's world. "He's gone, Grace." Marcus left with Jennifer. They drove away together. The words echoed in the sacred space as Grace felt her knees buckle. Her fiancé had run away with her best friend on their wedding day, leaving her abandoned at the altar like some tragic character from a movie she'd never wanted to star in. The pastor cleared his throat awkwardly, unsure whether to comfort the bride or dismiss the congregation. Grace could hear whispers rippling through the pews behind her. "Did you know about this? I always thought Jennifer was too close to him." Poor Grace, how humiliating. The white roses in her bouquet seemed to mock her as she clutched them with shaking hands. She had planned this day for 2 years, dreaming of the perfect wedding, the perfect marriage, the perfect life. Instead, she was standing alone while her dreams crumbled around her like autumn leaves. Grace's mother rushed forward from the front pew, her face pale with shock and fury. "Sweetheart, we need to get you out of here." But Grace couldn't move. She stared at the empty space where Marcus should have been standing, where he should have been promising to love her forever. Instead, he was probably miles away by now, holding Jennifer's hand and laughing about how they'd escaped the boring life he would have had with Grace. The truth was, Grace had sensed something was wrong for weeks. Marcus had been distant, always finding excuses to stay late at work or go out with friends. When she tried to talk about the wedding details, he'd wave her off, saying he trusted her judgment. She'd convinced herself he was just stressed about the commitment, that all grooms got nervous. How wrong she had been. "Grace, honey, people are staring," her mother whispered urgently. "Let's go to the back room." Finally, Grace found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "He really left me." The organist, unsure what else to do, began playing a soft hymn to fill the terrible silence. Guests started standing up, some approaching to offer awkward condolences, others hurrying toward the exits as if embarrassment were contagious. Grace watched them go, each departure feeling like another small abandonment. Her father appeared at her other side, his jaw clenched with barely contained rage. "That coward doesn't deserve you, sweetheart." He never did. But his words felt hollow. If Marcus didn't deserve her, why had he been so easy to win over? Why had Jennifer, who'd been Grace's best friend since college, found it so simple to steal him away? The questions burned in Grace's mind as she finally allowed her parents to guide her toward the back of the church. As they walked down the aisle, Grace caught glimpses of sympathetic faces and pitying glances. Mrs. Chin from her neighborhood looked ready to cry. Her cousin Rebecca was shaking her head in disbelief. Grace's college friends huddled together, whispering furiously about Marcus and Jennifer's betrayal. The reception hall was already set up with white linens, gold centerpieces, and a 3-tier cake that Grace had spent hours designing with the baker. 200 plates of salmon and chicken would go to waste. The DJ had probably already set up his equipment, ready to play their first dance song, At Last by Etta James. Grace almost laughed at the bitter irony. In the church's back room, Grace finally broke down. The tears came in waves, soaking the delicate lace of her bodice as her mother held her tight. All the planning, all the dreams, all the hope she'd poured into this day, everything was ruined. "How could they do this to me?" Grace sobbed. "Jennifer was supposed to be my maid of honor. She helped me pick out this dress. She threw my bachelorette party." "Some people are just selfish, baby," her father said, his voice rough with emotion. "This isn't about you not being good enough. This is about them being terrible people." But Grace couldn't shake the feeling that somehow she had failed. Maybe she hadn't been exciting enough for Marcus. Maybe she'd been too focused on the wedding and not enough on their relationship. Maybe Jennifer had something Grace lacked, some spark or passion that made men want to fight for her instead of run away. The worst part was the public humiliation. By tomorrow, everyone in their hometown would know that Grace Williams had been left at the altar. Social media would buzz with photos and gossip. She'd become the cautionary tale that mothers whispered to their daughters about trusting the wrong people. As Grace finally began to calm down, still wearing her wedding dress that now felt like a costume for a play she no longer wanted to perform in, she made a decision that surprised even herself. "I'm leaving," she announced, her voice stronger than it had been all day. "Leaving where, honey?" her mother asked, dabbing at Grace's mascara-stained cheeks with a tissue. "Here. This town. Everything." Grace stood up, her wedding dress rustling around her. "I can't stay here and face everyone's pity. I can't walk down Main Street and have people whisper about the girl who got left at the altar." Her parents exchanged worried glances. "Grace, you don't need to make any big decisions right now," her father said gently. "You're in shock." But Grace's mind was already working, planning her escape from this nightmare. She had savings from her job as an elementary school teacher. She had skills, dreams she'd put on hold for Marcus and their future together. Maybe it was time to chase those dreams for herself. "I've always wanted to open a bakery," she said, her voice growing steadier with each word. "I've been talking about it for years, but Marcus always said it was too risky, that teaching was more stable." Her mother nodded slowly. "You do make the most beautiful cakes, sweetheart. There's that little coastal town we visited last summer, Seabrook Bay. Remember how peaceful it was? How the people were so friendly?" Grace could picture it now, the charming main street lined with small shops, the ocean breeze, the sense of possibility she'd felt walking along the harbor. It was the opposite of everything she was leaving behind. No memories of Marcus, no judgmental neighbors, no constant reminders of the life she'd thought she wanted. Just a fresh start and the chance to build something entirely her own. As Grace looked around the small church room where she'd planned to take photos as a new bride, she felt something shift inside her. The crushing weight of humiliation was still there, but underneath it, a tiny seed of determination began to grow. Marcus and Jennifer had taken her dignity, her trust, and her carefully planned future. But they couldn't take her dreams. "Will you help me pack?" she asked her parents. Her father smiled for the first time since the terrible news. "Anything you need, sweetheart. Anything at all." Grace nodded, already mentally saying goodbye to the life she'd known. Tomorrow she would start over. Tomorrow she would begin the journey toward becoming the woman she was meant to be, not the woman she tried to be for someone who didn't value her. But tonight she would grieve for the dreams that died at this altar, and then she would bury them forever. 6 months later, Grace stood in front of her small bakery in Seabrook Bay, watching the sunrise paint the ocean in shades of pink and gold. The salty breeze carried the scent of fresh bread from her ovens, mixing with the ocean air in a combination that never failed to make her smile. Sweet Dreams Bakery was everything she'd imagined and more. The move had been harder than Grace expected, but every difficult day had been worth it. She'd used her savings to lease the small storefront on Harbor Street, just 2 blocks from the water. The previous owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson, had left behind vintage display cases and a well-maintained kitchen that Grace had fallen in love with immediately. The first month had been lonely. Grace knew no one in Seabrook Bay except Mrs. Patterson, who'd moved to Florida to be closer to her grandchildren. Grace spent her days learning the rhythms of the small town, figuring out what locals wanted from a bakery, and her evenings exploring the coastline or reading in her small apartment above the shop. But gradually customers began to find her. The mailman, Mr. Rodriguez, stopped by every Tuesday for her cinnamon rolls. The librarian, Helen Torres, ordered custom cupcakes for the monthly book club meetings. Grace's chocolate chip cookies became popular with the high school students who walked past on their way home. It was on a rainy Thursday morning in October that Grace first met the person who would change everything. Grace was arranging fresh muffins in the display case when she heard the bell above her door chime. She looked up to see a small figure in a bright yellow raincoat standing just inside the entrance, water dripping from the hood that covered most of the child's face. "Good morning," Grace called out warmly. "Can I help you with something?" The hood was pushed back to reveal a beautiful little girl with dark curls and big brown eyes that seemed too serious for someone so young. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old, and she was alone. "Do you have chocolate milk?" the little girl asked in a soft voice. Grace's heart melted immediately. "I don't have chocolate milk, sweetheart, but I have hot chocolate. Would that work?" The girl nodded eagerly, and Grace could see her trying not to shiver in her wet clothes. Grace quickly prepared a cup of hot chocolate, adding extra marshmallows, and brought it to one of the small tables by the window. "What's your name, honey?" Grace asked, sitting down across from the girl. "Sophia," the girl replied, wrapping her small hands around the warm mug. "My daddy works at the ocean place where they study the fish." Grace nodded. She'd heard about the marine research station on the outskirts of town. "Are you supposed to be here by yourself?" Sophia's eyes grew wide and she shook her head quickly. "I walked here from school. Daddy doesn't know. He's always working late, and Mrs. Johnson who watches me had to leave early today." Grace felt a pang of concern. This little girl was clearly looking for somewhere safe and warm to wait, but Grace couldn't let her stay without knowing her father was aware of where she was. "How about we call your daddy and let him know you're here?" Grace suggested gently. Sophia's face fell. "He'll be mad. He told me to always stay with Mrs. Johnson after school." "I don't think he'll be mad, sweetheart. I think he'll be worried about you. Parents worry when they don't know where their children are. After some gentle coaxing, Sophia provided her father's phone number. Grace called the Marine station and spoke to a receptionist who promised to get Nathan Brooks immediately. Mr. Brooks? This is Grace Williams at Sweet Dreams Bakery on Harbor Street. I have your daughter Sophia here with me. Sophia? The man's voice was filled with panic. Is she okay? What happened? She's fine, Grace assured him quickly. She came in out of the rain and said Mrs. Johnson had to leave early. She's having hot chocolate and she's completely safe. Grace could hear the relief in Nathan's voice when he replied. Thank you so much. I'll be right there. Please don't let her leave. Of course not, Grace said. Take your time. While they waited, Grace learned that Sophia was in first grade at Seabrook Elementary, that her favorite color was purple, and that she loved to draw pictures of sea animals. The little girl seemed to relax as she warmed up, and Grace found herself charmed by Sophia's sweet personality and thoughtful questions. Do you like making cakes? Sophia asked, swinging her legs from the chair that was almost too big for her. I love it, Grace replied. It's like creating something beautiful that also makes people happy when they taste it. My mommy used to make me cookies, Sophia said quietly, her voice growing sad. But she went to heaven when I was little. Grace's heart broke for this sweet child. I'm sorry about your mommy, sweetheart. Daddy says she's watching over us, but sometimes I wish she could make cookies again. Sophia looked up at Grace with those big, serious eyes. Your cookies smell really good. Do they taste as good as they smell? Would you like to try one? Grace asked, already moving toward the display case. She selected a soft sugar cookie decorated with purple icing in the shape of a flower and brought it back to Sophia. The little girl took a small bite, and her face lit up with the first genuine smile Grace had seen since she'd arrived. This is the best cookie ever, Sophia declared, taking another bite. It tastes like happiness. Before Grace could respond, the bakery door burst open and a tall man with dark hair and worried green eyes rushed inside. He was still wearing a lab coat over jeans and sneakers, and there were raindrops in his hair. Sophia, he called out, relief flooding his voice as he spotted his daughter at the table. Daddy, Sophia ran to him and Nathan swept her up in a tight hug. Grace watched the reunion with a warm feeling in her chest. It was clear that Nathan Brooks loved his daughter deeply, and that Sophia adored her father despite his apparent struggles with single parenthood. Nathan carried Sophia back to the table, setting her down gently before turning to Grace with grateful eyes. I can't thank you enough. When the school called and said Sophia never got on the bus and then Mrs. Johnson said she'd had to leave. He ran a hand through his damp hair. I was imagining every terrible thing that could happen. She's a smart girl, Grace said warmly. She came somewhere safe and warm. Nathan looked around the cozy bakery, taking in the cheerful yellow walls, the display cases full of pastries, and the small tables with their blue gingham tablecloths. This is really nice. I've been meaning to stop by since you opened, but work has been busy, Sophia finished for him. Daddy's always busy with the fish. Nathan's cheeks reddened slightly. I study marine ecosystems, he explained to Grace. And yes, I suppose I have been working too much lately. Grace could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of responsibility that came with being a single parent while trying to maintain a demanding career. She remembered feeling overwhelmed just managing her own life after the wedding disaster. She couldn't imagine doing it while caring for a child too. Well, you're both welcome here anytime, Grace said sincerely. I don't get many customers during the afternoon, so it's nice to have company. Sophia looked up at her father with hopeful eyes. Can we come back, Daddy? Grace makes cookies that taste like happiness. Nathan smiled at his daughter's description, and Grace was struck by how much younger and more handsome he looked when he wasn't worried. I think that can be arranged, Princess. As Nathan helped Sophia back into her raincoat, Grace impulsively grabbed a small box and filled it with cookies. For later, she explained, handing the box to Nathan. And please call me if you ever need someone to watch Sophia in an emergency. I know we just met, but she's a wonderful little girl. Nathan looked surprised by the generous offer. That's very kind of you, but I couldn't impose. It's not an imposition, Grace assured him. I taught elementary school before I moved here. I love kids and Sophia is special. Sophia beamed at the compliment, and Nathan looked as if he might tear up from gratitude. Thank you, he said quietly. We might just take you up on that. As they prepared to leave, Sophia turned back to Grace one more time. Will you be here tomorrow after school? I'll be here, Grace promised. Good, Sophia said with satisfaction. I want to show you my drawing of a sea turtle." After they left, Grace stood in her empty bakery with a smile on her face that felt different from any she'd worn in months. For the first time since her wedding day disaster, she felt like she might be exactly where she belonged. She didn't know it yet, but the little girl in the yellow raincoat and her devoted father were about to become the family she'd never known she needed. True to her word, Sophia appeared at Sweet Dreams Bakery the next afternoon, this time accompanied by Mrs. Johnson, an elderly woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. "I hope it's all right," Mrs. Johnson said to Grace. "Sophia talked about nothing else except coming back to see you and show you her drawing." "Of course it's all right," Grace replied, genuinely delighted to see the little girl again. "I've been looking forward to seeing that sea turtle." Sophia practically bounced with excitement as she pulled a folded piece of paper from her backpack. The drawing showed a green sea turtle swimming through blue waves, with a little girl and a woman standing on the shore watching it. The figures were drawn in the simple but expressive style typical of a 6-year-old, but Grace could see the care and thought Sophia had put into every line. "This is beautiful, Sophia," Grace said, studying the drawing with genuine admiration. "You're a very talented artist." "The turtle is like the ones Daddy studies," Sophia explained proudly. "And that's me on the beach and that's—" She paused, looking suddenly shy. "That's who, sweetheart?" Grace asked gently. "That's my new friend who makes cookies that taste like happiness," Sophia said in a rush, her cheeks turning pink. Grace felt her heart squeeze. She carefully pinned the drawing to the bulletin board behind the counter, right where everyone could see it. "It's going to have a place of honor right here," she announced. For the next hour, Grace and Sophia chatted while the little girl enjoyed a snickerdoodle and a glass of milk. Mrs. Johnson knitted quietly in the corner, occasionally smiling at their conversation. Grace learned that Sophia loved dolphins, purple crayons, and books about princesses. Sophia learned that Grace had traveled to 7 different states, knew how to make bread shapes like animals, and had once had a pet goldfish named Butterscotch. "Can you teach me to make cookies?" Sophia asked as they were preparing to leave. "I'd love to," Grace replied, "but we'd need to ask your daddy first." Sophia nodded seriously. "I'll ask him tonight." The next few weeks fell into a comfortable pattern. Sophia would arrive at the bakery most afternoons with Mrs. Johnson, who was happy to sit with her knitting while Sophia and Grace talked. Grace began keeping ingredients set aside for simple baking projects they could do together. Sophia proved to be an eager student, carefully measuring flour and sugar with the same focused attention she brought to everything else. Grace found herself looking forward to these visits more than she'd expected. Sophia's enthusiasm was infectious, and her innocent observations about the world often made Grace laugh out loud. The little girl seemed to bloom under Grace's attention, becoming more talkative and playful with each visit. But Nathan remained mysteriously absent. Grace began to wonder if he was avoiding the bakery, perhaps uncomfortable with his daughter's growing attachment to a woman he barely knew. The thought worried Grace more than she wanted to admit. Her concern grew when Sophia mentioned that her daddy worked through dinner most nights, eating sandwiches at his desk while reviewing data from his research. Grace, who had learned to read the signs of a parent struggling to balance work and family, recognized the classic symptoms of a father doing his best but slowly burning out. It was on a particularly busy Saturday morning that Nathan finally appeared in her bakery again. Grace was behind the counter, boxing up a dozen cupcakes for a customer, when she heard Sophia's delighted squeal. "Daddy, you came." Grace looked up to see Nathan lifting his daughter into a hug, spinning her around once before setting her down. He was dressed more casually today, in jeans and a blue sweater that brought out his eyes, and he looked less exhausted than he had during their first meeting. "I promised I'd take you for pancakes, remember?" Nathan said to Sophia. "But maybe we could get some of Grace's famous cookies to go with them." Grace's heart did a little skip at the way he said her name, warm and familiar as if they'd known each other much longer than a few brief encounters. "Grace, this is my daddy," Sophia announced proudly, as if Grace might have forgotten. "Daddy, Grace teaches me to make cookies and she puts my drawings on the wall and she knows everything about princesses." Nathan's eyes met Grace's over Sophia's head, and she saw amusement and gratitude there in equal measure. "She's mentioned you once or twice," he said with a straight face that made Grace laugh. "Just once or twice?" Grace teased, wiping flour from her hands on her apron. "Maybe a few hundred times," Nathan admitted, his serious expression breaking into a grin. "I've heard about the cookie lessons, the drawing gallery, and something about a story involving a dragon who learned to bake birthday cakes." Grace felt her cheeks warm. She'd gotten carried away during a rainy afternoon, making up an elaborate fairy tale to entertain Sophia. "She's a wonderful audience for stories." She's a wonderful kid, Nathan agreed, his voice full of love as he looked down at his daughter. Though I suspect she's been monopolizing your afternoons. I hope she hasn't been any trouble. Never, Grace said firmly. She's been the best part of my day. She meant it completely, but she wasn't prepared for the way Nathan's expression softened at her words, or the way her pulse quickened when he smiled at her like that. In that case, Nathan said, maybe you'd let me buy you coffee sometime? As a thank you for being so kind to Sophia. Grace felt Sophia's eager gaze bouncing between them, and she could practically see the little girl holding her breath waiting for the answer. I'd like that, Grace heard herself saying. Can Grace come to pancakes with us now? Sophia asked hopefully. Nathan looked at Grace questioningly. If you're not too busy? Grace looked around her bakery. The Saturday morning rush was winding down, and her part-time helper Jamie could handle the afternoon crowd. More importantly, she found herself genuinely wanting to spend more time with both Nathan and Sophia. You know what? I think I could close early today, Grace decided. Let me just get Jamie to cover the rest of the afternoon. Sophia cheered, and Nathan's smile grew even warmer. As Grace hung up her apron and grabbed her purse, she caught sight of herself in the mirror behind the register. Her hair was a bit messed up from the morning's work, and there was a smudge of chocolate on her cheek, but her eyes were bright with an excitement she hadn't felt in months. The three of them walked to Molly's Diner, just 2 blocks down Harbor Street. Sophia chattered happily between them, pointing out interesting shells she'd collected from the beach and asking Nathan to explain why some seaweed was green and some was brown. Grace found herself charmed by their easy father-daughter relationship and impressed by Nathan's patience with Sophia's endless questions. At the diner, they squeezed into a corner booth, with Sophia insisting that Grace sit next to her so she could show her the pictures in the children's menu. Over stacks of blueberry pancakes and coffee that was surprisingly good, Grace learned more about Nathan's work and his life in Seabrook Bay. He'd moved to the town 3 years ago, after his wife died in a car accident in Portland. The Marine Research Station had offered him a position studying the effects of climate change on local sea turtle populations, and he'd thought the small coastal town would be a good place to raise Sophia away from the painful memories of their old life. It's been an adjustment, Nathan admitted, cutting Sophia's pancakes into smaller pieces without interrupting his story. Balancing work with single parenting, finding reliable childcare, making sure Sophia feels settled and happy. Grace could hear the exhaustion and worry underlying his words. She recognized the weight of responsibility he carried, trying to be everything to his daughter while maintaining his career and healing from his own grief. You're doing a great job, Grace told him sincerely. Sophia is happy, confident, and clearly adores you. Some days I feel like I'm barely keeping my head above water, Nathan confessed. Work has been demanding lately. We're in the middle of a major research project, and I've been putting in longer hours than I should. That's why Mrs. Johnson had to leave early that day, Sophia piped up, syrup on her chin. And that's why I found Grace. Nathan reached over to wipe his daughter's face with a napkin. Best mistake you ever made, princess. Looking at Grace with those serious green eyes, he added quietly, best mistake any of us ever made. The words hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning that made Grace's cheeks warm again. She was saved from having to respond by Sophia's announcement that she needed to use the bathroom. As Nathan helped his daughter down from the booth, Grace found herself watching them with a feeling she couldn't quite name. There was something about their little family unit that called to her, that made her want to be part of their story instead of just an observer. When they returned, Sophia had a new request. Grace, will you come see the ocean with us? Daddy promised to show me where the sea turtles nest and you should see it too. Grace looked at Nathan, who nodded encouragingly. If you have time, I'd love to show you the research station. And Sophia's right about the turtle nesting sites. It's pretty amazing. As they left the diner and walked toward Nathan's truck, Grace realized that for the first time since her wedding day disaster, she was looking forward to something with pure, uncomplicated joy. No anxiety about whether she was good enough, no second-guessing her decisions, no fear of being left behind. Just the simple pleasure of spending time with people who seemed genuinely happy to have her around. It felt like the beginning of something beautiful. Could you imagine standing at that altar, watching everyone you trusted walk away? What would you do if your whole life crumbled in one moment? Share your thoughts below and don't forget to subscribe for more heartwarming stories like this one. The research station sat on a bluff overlooking the Pacific, a collection of modern buildings connected by covered walkways that protected visitors from the ocean winds. As Nathan's truck pulled into the parking lot, Grace could see why Sophia was fascinated by her father's work. The view was spectacular, with endless blue water stretching to the horizon and waves crashing against the rocky coastline below. "This is where Daddy saves the sea turtles," Sophia announced proudly as they walked toward the main building. "I don't save them exactly," Nathan corrected gently. "I study them to understand how to protect them better." Inside, the station buzzed with quiet activity. Graduate students bent over computers analyzing data, researchers examined water samples under microscopes, and in one large tank, Grace was amazed to see a juvenile sea turtle swimming gracefully through the clear water. "This is Luna," Nathan explained, leading Grace and Sophia to the tank. "She was injured in a fishing net about 6 months ago. We've been helping her recover before we can release her back to the ocean." Grace watched the turtle glide through the water with elegant movements that seemed almost like dancing. "She's beautiful. Can I touch her, Daddy?" Sophia asked, though she'd clearly asked this question many times before. "Not today, Princess. Remember, we have to let her rest so she can get strong enough to go home." Sophia nodded seriously, but Grace could see the longing in her eyes as she watched Luna swim. It was clear the little girl had formed an attachment to the recovering turtle. Nathan showed them through the rest of the facility, explaining his research in terms simple enough for Sophia to understand but detailed enough to satisfy Grace's curiosity. She was impressed by his passion for his work and the way he made complex environmental science accessible and interesting. "The turtle population here has been declining for the past decade," Nathan explained as they stood in his small office overlooking the ocean. "We're trying to understand why and what we can do to help them recover." "Is it because of pollution?" Grace asked, watching Sophia color in a sea turtle coloring book she'd found on Nathan's desk. "Partly. Also climate change affecting their nesting beaches, fishing nets, boat traffic." Nathan's expression grew serious. "It's a complex problem that requires long-term study and protection efforts." Grace could see why Nathan often worked late. The scope of his research was enormous, and she sensed that he felt personally responsible for finding solutions to protect the creatures he studied. "It must be rewarding work," she said, "knowing that what you're doing could make a real difference." "Some days," Nathan agreed. "Other days it feels like trying to hold back the ocean with a teacup." They were interrupted by Dr. Rachel Kim, Nathan's research partner, who appeared in the doorway with a clipboard and an apologetic smile. "Sorry to interrupt," Dr. Kim said, "but we just got the results back from the water samples and there's something you need to see." Nathan glanced at Grace and Sophia uncertainly. "I should probably—" "Go ahead," Grace assured him. "We'll be fine here." While Nathan stepped out to review the data with Dr. Kim, Grace helped Sophia finish her coloring page and listened to the little girl's detailed explanations of each sea creature she'd drawn. Grace was struck again by Sophia's intelligence and creativity, and by the obvious pride she took in her father's work. "Daddy works really hard to help the animals," Sophia said, carefully staying inside the lines as she colored Luna's shell green. "Sometimes he forgets to eat lunch because he's thinking about the turtles." "Does that worry you?" Grace asked gently. Sophia nodded. "Mrs. Johnson makes him sandwiches, but sometimes he leaves them on his desk and forgets about them. Mommy used to make sure he ate." Grace's heart ached for both Nathan and Sophia. She could see how much the little girl missed having a mother figure to take care of the practical details of daily life, and how much Nathan struggled to balance his demanding work with single parenthood. When Nathan returned 20 minutes later, his hair was disheveled from running his hands through it, and Grace could see stressed lines around his eyes. "Everything okay?" she asked quietly. "Water temperature readings are higher than expected," Nathan explained, trying to keep his voice light for Sophia's sake. "It could affect the turtle nesting season." Grace could see that this was a bigger problem than he was letting on, but she didn't push for details with Sophia listening. "Are you hungry, Daddy?" Sophia asked, looking up from her coloring. "You missed lunch again." Nathan looked surprised, as if he hadn't realized how late it had gotten. "I guess I did. How about I make dinner for all of us?" Grace offered impulsively. "I could cook at my place if you don't mind leftovers and simple food." "Grace, you don't have to," Nathan began. "I want to," Grace said firmly. "Besides, Sophia promised to help me test a new cookie recipe, didn't you, sweetheart?" Sophia nodded eagerly. "Oatmeal cookies with chocolate chips and coconut." Nathan looked between Grace and his daughter, and Grace could see him weighing his natural inclination to handle everything himself against his exhaustion and Sophia's obvious excitement about the invitation. "If you're sure it's not too much trouble," he said finally. "No trouble at all," Grace assured him. Grace's apartment above the bakery was small but cozy, with warm yellow walls, comfortable furniture she'd brought from her old life, and windows that looked out over the harbor. She'd made it feel like home with soft throws, books on every surface and plants that thrived in the ocean air. While Grace started dinner, Sophia explored the apartment with the careful curiosity of a well-behaved child, asking permission before touching anything and exclaiming over Grace's collection of cookbooks and the framed photos from her travels. "You went to so many places," Sophia said, studying a picture of Grace at the Grand Canyon. "Did you go by yourself?" "Sometimes," Grace replied, not mentioning that most of those trips had been planned around Marcus's work schedule, or that she'd often felt lonely even when she wasn't alone. Traveling can be an adventure no matter who you're with. Nathan helped by setting the table and keeping Sophia entertained while Grace cooked. She made spaghetti with homemade sauce, garlic bread, and a simple salad, nothing fancy but the kind of comfort food that filled both stomach and soul. During dinner, Grace learned more about their life together. Nathan told stories about Sophia's first attempts at beachcombing, when she tried to bring home every shell and piece of sea glass she found. Sophia described her favorite teacher at school and her best friend Emma, who was teaching her to braid friendship bracelets. "Tell Grace about the hermit crab, Daddy," Sophia said between bites of spaghetti. Nathan laughed. Sophia found a hermit crab on the beach last month and was convinced it needed a bigger shell. She spent 2 hours collecting shells and offering them to this crab, trying to convince it to upgrade its housing situation. "Did it work?" Grace asked, charmed by the image of Sophia as a tiny real estate agent for hermit crabs. "Eventually," Nathan said. "Though I think the crab was just tired of being bothered by a persistent 6-year-old. After dinner, they worked together to make the oatmeal cookies, with Sophia carefully measuring ingredients under Grace's guidance while Nathan cleaned up the dinner dishes. The kitchen felt warm and alive with their shared activity, filled with laughter and the smell of baking cookies. When it was time for Sophia's bath and bedtime routine, Nathan looked reluctant to leave. "We should probably head home," he said, though he made no move to gather their things. "Why don't you let me read Sophia a story while you finish that research report you mentioned?" Grace suggested. "I brought some children's books from my teaching days." Nathan looked surprised by the offer. "Are you sure? She can be particular about her bedtime routine." "I'm sure," Grace said. "We'll be fine, won't we, Sophia?" Sophia nodded eagerly, already examining Grace's small collection of picture books. While Nathan worked at Grace's kitchen table, his laptop open and research papers spread around him, Grace and Sophia curled up on the couch with a book about a brave little mermaid. Sophia listened intently to every word, occasionally asking questions or making observations that showed how carefully she was following the story. "The mermaid reminds me of Luna," Sophia said as Grace closed the book. "She's far from home but she's trying to be brave." "That's a very wise observation," Grace said, smoothing Sophia's curls back from her face. "Sometimes being brave means accepting help from new friends." Sophia was quiet for a moment, then looked up at Grace with those serious brown eyes. "Are you our new friend?" The question hit Grace square in the chest, so innocent and hopeful that it took her breath away. "I'd love to be your friend, sweetheart." "Good," Sophia said with satisfaction, snuggling closer to Grace's side. "I think you make Daddy smile more." Before Grace could respond to that observation, Nathan appeared in the doorway. "Time for bed, princess," he said softly. As Nathan gathered Sophia's things and prepared to leave, the little girl turned back to Grace one more time. "Will you be here tomorrow?" she asked, the same question she'd asked after their first meeting. "I'll be here," Grace promised. "And can we make those cookies with the purple icing you told me about?" "If your daddy says it's okay." Sophia looked at Nathan hopefully and he nodded with a smile. "I think that can be arranged." After they left, Grace stood in her quiet apartment, surrounded by the evidence of their evening together. 3 plates in the dish drainer, cookie crumbs on the counter, one of Sophia's hair ribbons forgotten on the coffee table. The space felt different somehow, warmer and more alive than it had in months. She realized that for the first time since moving to Seabrook Bay, she hadn't spent a single moment thinking about Marcus or Jennifer or the life she'd left behind. Instead, she'd been completely present in this new moment, with these new people who seemed to genuinely enjoy her company. It was a revelation that both thrilled and terrified her. Grace had been hurt so badly by trusting the wrong people that she'd built walls around her heart without even realizing it. But Sophia and Nathan seemed to be finding cracks in those walls, letting in light and warmth and possibility. As Grace cleaned up the last of the dinner dishes, she caught herself humming, something she hadn't done since before her wedding day. The melody was simple and happy, like the feeling growing in her chest. For the first time in a long time, Grace was excited about tomorrow. November brought cooler weather and shorter days to Seabrook Bay, but Grace barely noticed the change in seasons. Her life had developed a new rhythm centered around the daily visits from Sophia and the increasingly frequent appearances of Nathan, who had started stopping by the bakery not just to pick up his daughter, but to chat with Grace over coffee and whatever treats she'd made that day. The purple icing cookies had been a huge success, leading to weekly baking lessons where Sophia learned to cream butter and sugar, crack eggs without getting shells in the bowl, and decorate cookies with the focused concentration of a master artist. Grace loved watching the little girl's confidence grow with each successful batch of treats. "Can we make cupcakes for my class?" Sophia asked one afternoon as she carefully piped frosting roses onto sugar cookies. "It's my turn to bring snacks for our Thanksgiving party." "Of course," Grace replied. "What kind would you like?" "Chocolate with orange frosting," Sophia said immediately. "Like fall leaves." Grace had learned to love Sophia's creative approach to food. The little girl saw colors and flavors and combinations that shouldn't work but somehow always did. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and Grace found herself experimenting with new recipes inspired by Sophia's suggestions. "Fall leaf cupcakes it is," Grace agreed. "But we'll need to ask your daddy if it's okay to make enough for your whole class." "He'll say yes," Sophia said confidently. "Daddy likes it when I'm happy and baking with you makes me really happy." The simple statement made Grace's heart squeeze. Over the past month, she'd watched Sophia blossom from a somewhat shy little girl into a confident, talkative child who approached each day with excitement and curiosity. Grace knew she couldn't take credit for all of that growth, but she was proud to be part of it. When Nathan arrived that evening to pick up Sophia, he found them both covered in flour and giggling over a batch of lopsided but delicious test cupcakes. "Let me guess," Nathan said, surveying the chaos in the bakery kitchen. "Another successful baking experiment?" "We made fall leaves," Sophia announced, holding up a cupcake decorated with swirls of orange, yellow, and red frosting. "Grace says I have an artist's eye for color." "You definitely do," Nathan agreed, accepting the cupcake Sophia offered him. He took a bite and his eyes widened in surprise. "This is incredible. What's in the frosting?" "Cream cheese, a touch of cinnamon, and just a hint of maple syrup," Grace explained. Sophia's idea to add the maple. Nathan looked at his daughter with impressed admiration. "You're becoming quite the chef, princess." While Nathan and Sophia enjoyed their cupcakes, Grace cleaned up the kitchen. She was reaching for a mixing bowl on a high shelf when she felt Nathan's presence behind her. "Let me get that," he said, easily reaching the bowl she'd been stretching for. For a moment they stood close together, Grace's back almost touching Nathan's chest as he handed her the bowl. She could smell his cologne, something clean and masculine that made her pulse quicken. When she turned to thank him, she found his face much closer than she'd expected, his green eyes looking down at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Thank you," she said softly, very aware of how little space was between them. "Thank you," Nathan replied, his voice equally quiet. "For everything you've done for Sophia. For us." The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibility, until Sophia's voice broke the spell. "Can we make the class cupcakes tomorrow?" she asked from her perch on the step stool by the counter. "Tomorrow sounds perfect," Grace managed, stepping back and hoping her cheeks weren't as red as they felt. The next day was Saturday, and Nathan surprised Grace by showing up early to help with the cupcake project. "You don't have to help," Grace protested as he tied one of her aprons around his waist. "I'm sure you have better things to do on your day off." "I can't think of anything I'd rather do," Nathan said, and the sincerity in his voice made Grace's stomach flutter. They worked together easily, falling into a comfortable rhythm of measuring, mixing, and monitoring the ovens. Sophia appointed herself quality control supervisor, testing each batch of frosting and offering detailed critiques of their decorating techniques. "Daddy, your roses look like blobs," Sophia observed critically as Nathan attempted to pipe frosting flowers onto the cupcakes. "They're abstract roses," Nathan defended, laughing. "Very modern." "Grace, show Daddy how to make proper roses," Sophia commanded. Grace moved to stand beside Nathan at the decorating station, placing her hand over his to guide the piping bag. "It's all in the wrist motion," she explained, helping him create a perfect frosting rose. "See? You just need to." She trailed off, suddenly very aware of Nathan's attention focused not on the cupcake but on her face. When she looked up, their eyes met and held, and Grace felt that same electric tension from the night before. "I see," Nathan said quietly, though Grace suspected he wasn't talking about frosting techniques. "Are you two going to stare at each other all day or finish my cupcakes?" Sophia asked with the impatience of a 6-year-old who'd been ignored for 30 seconds. They both laughed, the tension breaking but not disappearing entirely. For the rest of the morning, Grace was hyper-aware of every accidental touch, every shared smile, every moment when Nathan's attention seemed to focus on her instead of the task at hand. By the time they finished, they had 4 dozen perfectly decorated fall leaf cupcakes and one very satisfied little girl. "These are the most beautiful cupcakes in the whole world," Sophia declared. "My class is going to love them." "I think you're right," Nathan agreed, admiring their handiwork. "Grace, I don't know how to thank you for all this." "Seeing Sophia happy is thanks enough," Grace replied, meaning it completely. "In that case," Nathan said, "maybe you'd let me take you both out for lunch? There's a new seafood place down by the marina that's supposed to be excellent." Grace felt a flutter of excitement at what sounded suspiciously like a date invitation, even with Sophia as a chaperone. "I'd love that," she said. The restaurant overlooked the harbor, with big windows that let in the autumn sunshine and offered views of the fishing boats and pleasure craft bobbing at their moorings. They were seated at a table by the window, with Sophia between Grace and Nathan, chattering happily about everything she could see from their vantage point. "Look, there's a seal," Sophia exclaimed, pointing toward the water. "And that boat has purple sails." Grace and Nathan followed her pointing finger, but Grace found herself watching Nathan's profile as he patiently answered Sophia's questions about the different types of boats in the harbor. There was something incredibly attractive about his devotion to his daughter, the way he made time for her interests and treated her observations as important. During lunch, Nathan told Grace more about his research and the challenges facing the local marine ecosystem. Grace shared stories from her teaching days and her dreams for expanding the bakery. Sophia contributed by drawing pictures on her paper placemat and offering commentary on the fish and chips they were all sharing. "Grace, why did you move to Seabrook Bay?" Sophia asked suddenly, looking up from her drawing of what appeared to be a whale wearing a crown. Grace felt Nathan's attention focus on her, and she realized she'd never really explained her background to either of them. They knew she'd been a teacher before opening the bakery, but she'd been deliberately vague about why she'd left her old life behind. "I needed a fresh start," Grace said carefully. "Sometimes adults need to find new places where they can be happy." "Were you sad in your old place?" Sophia asked with the directness that only children possessed. "Yes, sweetheart. I was very sad." Sophia nodded seriously. "Daddy and I were sad in Portland after Mommy went to heaven. That's why we moved here too." Nathan reached over to squeeze his daughter's hand. "But we're not sad anymore, are we, Princess?" "Nope," Sophia said cheerfully. "Now we have Grace and she makes everything better." Grace felt tears prick her eyes at the simple statement. In Sophia's 6-year-old logic, Grace had become part of their family unit, someone who belonged in their story. The thought was both wonderful and terrifying. After lunch, they walked along the marina, with Sophia running ahead to look at the boats while Grace and Nathan followed at a more leisurely pace. "She's getting very attached to you," Nathan said quietly, watching his daughter examine a particularly interesting sailboat. "I hope that's okay," Grace replied. "I've gotten very attached to her too." "More than okay," Nathan assured her. "I haven't seen her this happy since before we lost Claire. But I worry sometimes about what happens if—" He trailed off, but Grace understood what he wasn't saying. What happens if this doesn't work out? What happens if Grace decides their small-town life isn't enough for her? What happens if Sophia gets hurt? "I'm not going anywhere, Nathan," Grace said softly. "I know we haven't known each other long, but this feels right to me. Being here with both of you." Nathan stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "It feels right to me too," he admitted. "More right than anything has in a long time." Before Grace could respond, Sophia came running back to them, her cheeks pink from the ocean breeze and her eyes bright with excitement. "Can we go see Luna now?" she asked. "I want to show Grace how much bigger she's gotten." As they headed back toward Nathan's truck, Grace felt a sense of contentment settle over her like a warm blanket. For the first time since her disastrous wedding day, she was part of something real and good and full of possibility. She just hoped it would last. The call came at 6 in the morning on a Tuesday in late November. Grace was in her kitchen above the bakery, starting the first batch of morning pastries, when her phone rang with Nathan's number. "Grace." Nathan's voice was tight with worry. "I'm sorry to call so early, but Sophia's sick and she's asking for you. Mrs. Johnson is out of town visiting her sister, and I don't know what to do." Grace didn't hesitate. "I'll be right there." She turned off her ovens, left a note for Jamie explaining she'd be late opening the bakery, and drove to Nathan's house on the outskirts of town. She'd never been to their home before, but Nathan had given her directions, and she found the small blue cottage easily. Nathan answered the door looking exhausted and worried, his hair disheveled and yesterday's clothes wrinkled as if he'd slept in them. "Thank you for coming," he said, relief evident in his voice. "She woke up with a fever around midnight and she's been asking for you ever since." Grace could hear Sophia's voice from upstairs, a plaintive call that made her heart clench. "Grace? Is Grace here?" "I'm here, sweetheart," Grace called back, already heading for the stairs. She found Sophia in a small bedroom decorated with sea creatures and books, curled up in bed with flushed cheeks and bright, feverish eyes. The little girl's face lit up when she saw Grace. "You came," Sophia said, her voice hoarse but happy. "Of course I came," Grace replied, sitting on the edge of the bed and feeling Sophia's forehead with the back of her hand. "How are you feeling, baby?" "My throat hurts and I'm hot but also cold," Sophia complained, snuggling closer to Grace's side. "Daddy gave me medicine but it tastes yucky." Grace looked up at Nathan, who was hovering anxiously in the doorway. "Have you called her pediatrician?" "Dr. Martinez said it sounds like a standard virus. Keep her hydrated and comfortable. Bring her in if her fever goes above 102, Nathan recited. "But she won't eat anything and she keeps asking for you." Grace could see the exhaustion and stress in Nathan's face. Single parenting was hard enough when everything was going well, but dealing with a sick child alone was especially difficult. "Why don't you go shower and get some rest?" Grace suggested. "I'll stay with Sophia." "I can't ask you to do that," Nathan protested. "You have the bakery to run." "Jamie can handle the morning rush," Grace assured him. "And Sophia needs someone to take care of her. Let me help." Nathan looked between Grace and his daughter, clearly torn between his gratitude and his reluctance to impose on Grace's kindness. "Please, Daddy?" Sophia added her voice to Grace's argument. "I want Grace to stay." Finally Nathan nodded. "If you're sure. I haven't slept much and I should call the research station to let them know I won't be in today." For the next several hours, Grace settled into the comfortable routine of caring for a sick child. She coaxed Sophia to sip ginger ale and nibble on plain crackers, read stories in a soft voice, and simply sat beside the bed holding the little girl's hand when Sophia dozed fitfully. Nathan reappeared around noon, showered and wearing clean clothes, looking much more like himself. He brought Grace a cup of coffee and quietly took over fever monitoring duties while Grace stretched her legs. "How is she?" he asked, watching Sophia sleep. "Better, I think. Her fever's down a little and she kept some crackers down about an hour ago." Grace studied Nathan's face, noting the dark circles under his eyes. "How are you doing?" "Better now that you're here," Nathan admitted. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come. When she gets sick, she usually just wants to sleep, but today she kept crying for you." Grace felt a complex mix of emotions at his words. Joy that Sophia wanted her comfort, worry about the little girl's attachment to her, and something deeper, something that felt like love for both the child and her father. "I'm glad I could help," Grace said simply. When Sophia woke up in the afternoon, she was feeling well enough to be demanding. "Can Grace make me soup?" she asked Nathan. "The kind that tastes like hugs?" Nathan looked puzzled. "What kind of soup tastes like hugs?" "Grace knows," Sophia said confidently. Grace laughed. "I think she means chicken noodle soup. I mentioned once that my grandmother used to say good soup should taste like a hug from the inside." "We don't have ingredients for homemade soup," Nathan said apologetically. "I could run to the store," Grace offered. "If Sophia's feeling up to it, maybe we could make it together. Sometimes cooking helps kids feel better when they're sick." An hour later, Grace's arms full of grocery bags, they were in Nathan's kitchen preparing what Sophia had designated, get well soup. The little girl sat at the kitchen table, still in her pajamas but looking much brighter, carefully picking noodles out of the package while Grace chopped vegetables and Nathan cleaned up. The kitchen was small but cheerful, with yellow walls and white cabinets that reminded Grace of her own apartment. There were Sophia's drawings stuck to the refrigerator with magnets, a coffee mug with "World's Best Dad" written in child's handwriting, and family photos that showed happier times when Claire had been alive. Grace tried not to stare at the pictures of Nathan's late wife, but she couldn't help noticing that Claire had been beautiful, with dark hair and a warm smile that Sophia had inherited. In every photo the three of them looked happy and complete, the perfect little family. "Penny for your thoughts," Nathan said quietly, coming to stand beside Grace at the stove where she was stirring the soup. "Just thinking about how lucky Sophia is to have such loving parents," Grace replied honestly. Nathan was quiet for a moment. "Claire would have liked you," he said finally. She would have been grateful to know someone like you was looking after Sophia. The words hit Grace unexpectedly hard, and she had to blink back sudden tears. She hadn't realized how much she'd needed to hear that, or how worried she'd been about overstepping boundaries in a family that was still healing from loss. That means a lot to me, Grace managed. It means a lot to me too, Nathan said, his voice warm. Having you in our lives. Both of us. Before Grace could respond, Sophia announced that the noodles were ready and demanded to help serve the soup. They ate together at the small kitchen table, with Sophia pronouncing the soup officially delicious and asking for seconds. As the afternoon turned to evening, Sophia's energy began to flag again. Grace helped her into fresh pajamas and read her 3 stories before the little girl finally settled down for what looked like real sleep. I think the fever's broken, Nathan said quietly as they stood in the doorway watching Sophia sleep peacefully. She'll probably be much better tomorrow, Grace agreed. Kids bounced back quickly. They went downstairs to Nathan's living room, a comfortable space with a couch facing the fireplace and bookshelves lined with marine biology texts and children's books in equal measure. Nathan lit a fire while Grace curled up on the couch, suddenly exhausted from the emotional day. I owe you so much, Nathan said, settling beside her on the couch. Not just for today but for everything you've done for Sophia. For us. You don't owe me anything, Grace protested. I love spending time with Sophia. She's an amazing little girl. She is, Nathan agreed. And she loves you too. Sometimes I think she loves you as much as... He stopped himself as if he'd been about to say something he wasn't ready for. As much as what? Grace asked softly. Nathan looked at her for a long moment, his green eyes serious in the firelight. As much as I do, he said finally. The words hung in the air between them, simple and honest and full of possibility. Grace felt her heart speed up as Nathan reached for her hand, his fingers warm and gentle as they intertwined with hers. Grace, he said quietly, I know it hasn't been very long and I know I come with complications. A daughter who's already attached to you, a life that's still healing from loss. But I can't pretend anymore that you're just Sophia's friend or just someone who's been kind to us. Grace looked down at their joined hands, then back up at Nathan's face. What are you saying? I'm saying that I'm falling in love with you, Nathan said simply. And I think maybe you feel the same way. Grace felt tears prick her eyes, but this time they were tears of joy. I do feel the same way, she whispered. I love you too. Both of you. Nathan smiled, the kind of smile that lit up his whole face and made Grace understand why Sophia thought he was the best daddy in the world. Slowly, carefully, he leaned toward her, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to. She didn't want to. Their first kiss was soft and sweet, full of promise and the kind of tenderness that comes from taking time to really know someone. When they broke apart, Grace felt like she was glowing from the inside out. So what happens now? She asked, still holding Nathan's hand. Now, Nathan said, we figure out how to be a family. The word sent a thrill through Grace that she tried not to examine too closely. Family. After everything she'd been through, everything she'd lost, she was being offered the chance to be part of a family again. This time she was determined not to let anything destroy it. 2 weeks after Sophia's recovery, Grace's peaceful new life was shattered by a phone call that came on a busy Friday morning. Grace? Grace Williams? The voice was achingly familiar, and Grace felt her stomach drop as she recognized it. Marcus. Thank God I found you. I've been looking everywhere. Marcus Kelly sounded relieved and slightly out of breath, as if he'd been running. We need to talk. Grace stepped into the back room of her bakery, away from the customers browsing her display cases. I don't think we have anything to talk about. Please, Grace. Just hear me out. I made a terrible mistake. Grace closed her eyes, trying to steady herself. She'd been so happy these past few weeks with Nathan and Sophia, building something real and beautiful. The sound of Marcus's voice brought back all the pain and humiliation of that awful wedding day. You left me at the altar, Marcus. With 300 people watching. What kind of mistake was that? The biggest one of my life, Marcus said, his voice thick with what sounded like genuine regret. Jennifer and I, we thought we were in love, but it was just excitement, just the thrill of doing something forbidden. It fell apart within a month. Grace sank into the chair behind her desk, feeling like the wind had been knocked out of her. You called to tell me your affair didn't work out? I called to tell you I love you. I've always loved you, Grace. You were the best thing in my life and I was an idiot to throw it away. Through the doorway, Grace could see Nathan approaching the bakery with Sophia, just as they did every afternoon. The sight of them usually filled her with joy, but today it made her chest tight with anxiety. The two worlds of her life were about to collide and she wasn't ready. "Grace, are you there?" Marcus's voice demanded her attention. "I'm here," she said quietly. "But I'm not the same person you left behind, Marcus. I've built a new life here. In some tiny coastal town where nobody knows how talented you are? Grace, you're wasting your potential. I've been promoted to senior partner at the firm. We could travel, see the world, have the life we always planned. The life we always planned." Grace remembered those conversations, the dreams they'd shared about a big house in the suburbs, expensive vacations, the kind of success that looked impressive from the outside. It seemed like someone else's dream now. "I have to go," Grace said as Nathan and Sophia entered the bakery. "Don't call me again." "Wait," Marcus said urgently. "I'm coming to see you. Tonight. We need to have this conversation in person." The line went dead before Grace could protest. She stared at her phone, her hands shaking slightly as Nathan approached the back room. "Everything okay?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. Grace forced a smile, trying to push down the panic rising in her chest. "Everything's fine. Just a difficult supplier." It was a lie, and Grace hated herself for telling it, but she wasn't ready to explain Marcus to Nathan. Not when she was still processing the phone call herself. For the rest of the afternoon, Grace went through the motions of normalcy. She helped Sophia with her after-school snack, listened to stories about her day at school, and chatted with Nathan about his latest research findings. But underneath the familiar routine, anxiety churned in her stomach. Marcus was coming here. To her bakery, her safe space, the life she'd built without him. The thought made her feel nauseated. That evening, after Nathan and Sophia had gone home, Grace was cleaning up the bakery when she saw a familiar figure through the front window. Marcus stood on the sidewalk, looking exactly the same as he had 8 months ago, handsome and confident in his expensive suit. Grace's hands trembled as she unlocked the door, and she hated that he could still affect her this way. "Hello, Grace." Up close, Marcus looked tired, with lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. But he was still the man who'd promised to love her forever and then abandoned her on the most important day of her life. "You shouldn't have come," Grace said, not stepping aside to let him in. "You look beautiful," Marcus said, his eyes taking in her flour-dusted apron and the warm glow of her bakery behind her. "This place is charming. Very quaint." The way he said quaint made it sound like an insult, and Grace bristled. "What do you want, Marcus?" "To apologize. To explain. To ask you to forgive me and come home. This is my home now." Marcus glanced around the empty street, at the small shops and modest houses that made up Seabrook Bay's main drag. "Come on, Grace. This isn't you. You're meant for bigger things than running a small-town bakery." "How would you know what I'm meant for?" Grace asked, anger beginning to replace shock. "You never bothered to ask what I wanted when we were together." "I'm asking now." Marcus stepped closer, and Grace caught a whiff of his cologne, the same expensive scent he'd worn throughout their relationship. "What do you want, Grace?" Before Grace could answer, she heard Nathan's voice behind her. "Grace? Is everything all right?" She turned to see Nathan approaching from the direction of his truck, his face concerned and alert. Grace's heart sank as she realized how this must look to him, her talking intimately with a handsome stranger outside her bakery after hours. "Nathan," she said, her voice coming out strained. "This is Marcus. An old friend from Portland." Marcus extended his hand with the confident smile Grace remembered too well. "Marcus Kelly. Grace and I were engaged until recently." Grace saw Nathan's expression change, saw the way his eyes shifted between her and Marcus, and she could practically see him putting the pieces together. The woman who'd needed a fresh start, who'd been sad in her old life, who'd been engaged to this polished, successful man. "I see," Nathan said quietly, his handshake brief and polite. "I should let you two talk." "Nathan, wait," Grace called, but he was already walking back to his truck. "Serious boyfriend?" Marcus asked with interest. "He seems nice. Very simple." The condescension in Marcus's voice made Grace's anger flare. "Don't talk about him like that. Grace, sweetheart, look at yourself. You're covered in flour, working in a tiny bakery in the middle of nowhere, dating some small-town guy who probably doesn't understand your potential. This isn't the life you're meant for." "How dare you," Grace said, her voice low and furious. "How dare you show up here and judge the life I've built after you destroyed the one I had?" "I'm offering to fix what I broke," Marcus said, pulling an envelope from his jacket pocket. "I brought a business proposal. There's a space available downtown Portland, perfect for an upscale bakery. I've already spoken to investors who are interested in funding it." Grace stared at the envelope as if it were a snake. You want to buy me? I want to give you the life you deserve. The life we planned together. Grace thought about the life they'd planned. The big house where she'd felt lost and lonely. The social events where she'd smiled and nodded while Marcus networked. The dreams she'd put aside because they didn't fit with his vision of success. Then she thought about her small apartment above the bakery, warm and cozy and entirely hers. She thought about Sophia's laugh echoing through the kitchen as they baked together. She thought about Nathan's quiet strength and the way he looked at her like she was exactly where she belonged. I don't want that life anymore, Grace said firmly. I want this one. Marcus's confident expression faltered for the first time. You're making a mistake, Grace. In 5 years, you'll be trapped in this little town with nothing to show for your talents. In 5 years, Grace said, I'll be exactly where I choose to be. She stepped back inside her bakery and closed the door, turning the lock firmly. Through the window, she watched Marcus stand on the sidewalk for a long moment before finally walking away. Grace sank onto one of her small chairs, her legs suddenly unsteady. Marcus's visit had shaken her more than she wanted to admit, not because she had any desire to go back to him, but because of what Nathan must be thinking. She'd lied to him about the phone call. She'd introduced Marcus as an old friend instead of the man who'd left her at the altar. Nathan had every right to be confused and hurt. Grace needed to find him and explain everything, before Marcus's presence in town caused any more damage to the happiness she'd found here. She just hoped it wasn't already too late. Grace drove to Nathan's house with her heart pounding, practicing what she would say, how she would explain about Marcus and why she'd been less than honest. But when she arrived, the house was dark except for a single light in the upstairs window that she knew was Sophia's room. She knocked softly on the front door, not wanting to wake Sophia if she was already asleep. Nathan answered after a long moment, his expression guarded in a way she'd never seen before. Grace. Can we talk? She asked. Please? Nathan stepped outside, closing the door quietly behind him. They stood on his small front porch, the ocean breeze carrying the sound of waves in the distance. Grace could see the tension in Nathan's shoulders, the way he kept his distance from her. I should have told you about Marcus, Grace began. I should have been honest from the beginning. How long were you engaged? Nathan asked quietly. 2 years. We were supposed to be married 8 months ago. Grace took a shaky breath. He left me at the altar. Ran away with my maid of honor on our wedding day. Nathan's expression softened slightly. Grace, I'm sorry. That must have been devastating. It was, Grace admitted. That's why I came here, why I needed a fresh start. I was humiliated, heartbroken, and I felt like I couldn't trust my own judgment about people anymore. And now he wants you back. It wasn't a question, and Grace could hear the resignation in Nathan's voice that made her chest tight with panic. Yes, but I don't want him back, Grace said urgently. Nathan, what Marcus and I had, it wasn't real. I see that now. I was trying so hard to be the person he wanted me to be that I lost sight of who I actually was. Nathan was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the dark ocean. He can give you things I can't, Grace. A bigger life, more opportunities, financial security. I don't want those things, Grace protested. I want the life I've built here. With you and Sophia. Do you? Nathan turned to look at her, and Grace could see doubt and hurt in his green eyes. Or are you just running away from another difficult situation? The question hit Grace like a physical blow. Is that what you think? That I'm using you as an escape? I don't know what to think, Nathan said honestly. A few hours ago I thought we were building something real together. Now I find out you were engaged to someone else until recently, someone who clearly thinks this life isn't good enough for you. Marcus doesn't know me anymore, Grace said desperately. What we're building together, Nathan, it's the most real thing I've ever had. But she could see that her words weren't reaching him. Nathan had closed himself off, protecting his heart and his daughter from the possibility of being abandoned again. Maybe you should take some time to think about what you really want, Nathan said quietly. Before anyone else gets hurt. Nathan, please? I should go check on Sophia, Nathan said, already turning toward the door. Good night, Grace. Grace stood on the empty porch for several minutes after Nathan had gone inside, feeling like her world was crumbling around her again. But this time, it hurt so much worse than Marcus's betrayal because this time she was losing something that actually mattered. The next 3 days were the longest of Grace's life. Nathan didn't bring Sophia to the bakery, and when Grace called to check on them, Nathan was polite but distant, claiming they were both busy with school and work. Grace threw herself into baking, creating elaborate cakes and pastries that she ended up giving away because she couldn't concentrate on anything except the growing hole in her chest where Nathan and Sophia used to be. On Wednesday evening, Grace was closing the bakery when Sophia appeared at her door, alone and tearful. "Sophia." Grace rushed outside looking around for Nathan. "Sweetheart, where's your daddy?" "He's at work," Sophia said, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "I told Mrs. Johnson I had to use the bathroom, but I really came to see you." Grace knelt down to Sophia's level, her heart breaking at the sadness in the little girl's eyes. "What's wrong, baby?" "Daddy won't let me come see you anymore," Sophia said, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "He says you might be leaving soon and it's better if I don't get more attached." Grace felt her own tears threatening. "Oh, sweetheart. Are you leaving?" Sophia asked, her voice small and scared. "Are you going away like Mommy did?" "No," Grace said firmly, pulling Sophia into a tight hug. "I'm not leaving. I'm not going anywhere. But Daddy says the man who came to see you wants to take you to a big city." Grace held Sophia tighter, breathing in the familiar scent of her strawberry shampoo. "That man is from my old life, Sophia. My life before I met you and your daddy. I don't want my old life back." "Then why won't Daddy let me see you?" Grace struggled to find words that a 6-year-old could understand. Sometimes grown-ups get scared of being hurt, so they try to protect themselves and the people they love. "But you wouldn't hurt us," Sophia said with the absolute certainty of childhood. "No, sweetheart, I wouldn't. But your daddy doesn't know that for sure." Sophia pulled back to look at Grace with those serious brown eyes. "How do we make him know?" Before Grace could answer, Nathan's truck pulled up to the curb with a screech of brakes. He jumped out, his face frantic with worry, and rushed toward them. "Sophia Rose Brooks," he said, his voice stern but relief evident. "You scared me to death. Mrs. Johnson said you disappeared." "I came to see Grace," Sophia said, not looking sorry at all. "I missed her." Nathan's eyes met Grace's over Sophia's head, and Grace could see the conflict there, the love for his daughter warring with his fear of being hurt again. "Sophia, you can't just run off like that," Nathan said, kneeling down beside them. "What if something had happened to you?" "Nothing happened," Sophia said matter-of-factly. "I just came to talk to Grace about why you won't let me see her anymore." Nathan's face reddened. "That's complicated, Princess." "No, it's not," Sophia said with the stubborn tone Grace had come to know well. "You love Grace and Grace loves us and I love both of you. That's not complicated." "Sophia. Are you scared Grace will go to heaven like Mommy did?" Sophia asked, her voice suddenly very small. Grace saw Nathan flinch as if he'd been slapped. "No, baby, that's not. Because Grace won't," Sophia continued with absolute confidence. "Grace doesn't want to leave us. She told me so." Nathan looked at Grace questioningly and she nodded. "I told her I'm not going anywhere." "But what about Marcus?" Nathan asked quietly. "What about him?" Grace replied. "Nathan, I turned him down. I told him I didn't want the life he was offering." Nathan stared at her. "You did?" "Of course I did. Nathan, I love you. I love Sophia. I love the life we've been building together. Why would I give that up for someone who already proved he doesn't value me?" "Because he can give you more than I can," Nathan said, his voice raw with insecurity. Grace stood up, gently moving Sophia behind her, and stepped closer to Nathan. "He can give me money and status and a bigger apartment in a bigger city. But you give me something infinitely more valuable." "What's that?" "A home," Grace said simply. "A family. A place where I belong exactly as I am, not as someone else wants me to be." Nathan's careful control finally cracked, and Grace could see tears in his eyes. "I was so scared of losing you that I almost threw away the best thing that's happened to us since Claire died." "You haven't thrown anything away," Grace assured him. "We're still here. We're still us." Nathan reached for her hands, holding them tightly. "I'm sorry I doubted you. I'm sorry I let my fear make decisions for both of us. I'm sorry I wasn't completely honest about my past," Grace replied. "I should have trusted you with the truth from the beginning. Can we stop being sorry now and go get ice cream?" Sophia interrupted from behind Grace. "All this talking is making me hungry, and I want to celebrate that Grace isn't leaving." Both adults laughed, the tension finally breaking like a fever. "Ice cream sounds perfect," Nathan agreed, pulling both Grace and Sophia into a group hug that felt like coming home. As they walked toward Nathan's truck, Sophia between them holding both their hands, Grace felt a peace settle over her that she'd never experienced before. For the first time in her life she was exactly where she belonged, with people who loved her for exactly who she was. And she was never letting them go. The next morning brought unexpected drama to Seabrook Bay in the form of Marcus Kelly, who appeared at Sweet Dreams Bakery during the busy breakfast rush with a determined expression and a bouquet of expensive roses. Grace was behind the counter, serving coffee and pastries to the usual crowd of fishermen and early commuters, when Marcus walked through her door like he owned the place. Several customers turned to stare at the overdressed stranger in the designer suit, clearly out of place among the locals in their work clothes and casual jackets. "Grace," Marcus announced loudly enough for everyone to hear, "we need to finish our conversation." Grace felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment as every customer in the bakery turned to watch the scene unfolding. Mrs. Chin, who came in every Tuesday for cinnamon rolls, looked particularly interested, and Grace knew this story would be all over town within hours. "Marcus, this isn't the time or place," Grace said quietly, hoping to keep the situation from escalating. "Then when is the right time?" Marcus demanded, setting the roses on the counter with a dramatic flourish. "You won't answer my calls, you won't see me privately. Grace, I'm trying to save you from making the biggest mistake of your life." Grace became aware of the absolute silence in her bakery, everyone listening intently to what was clearly better entertainment than anything on television. "The biggest mistake of my life was trusting you," Grace said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Now please leave. Not until you hear what I have to say." Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out an official-looking document. "I've had papers drawn up for a business partnership. 50-50 ownership of an upscale bakery in downtown Portland. You'd have complete creative control, unlimited budget, your name on everything." Grace stared at the papers as if they were something venomous. "I already told you I'm not interested." "Because of him?" Marcus glanced around the small bakery dismissively. "Grace, look at this place. Look at these people. This isn't your level. You're meant for sophistication, for clients who appreciate artistry, for a life with culture and refinement." The insult to her customers and her chosen home made Grace's temper flare. "These people are my friends. This is my home. And I'm exactly where I want to be." "You're wasting your talent," Marcus pressed on, apparently oblivious to Grace's growing anger. "In 5 years, what will you have to show for it? A small-town bakery that barely breaks even and a relationship with someone who can't even afford to give you the life you deserve." The casual cruelty of his words, the dismissal of everything Grace had built and everyone she'd come to love, finally pushed her past her breaking point. "Get out," Grace said, her voice louder than she'd intended. "Get out of my bakery, get out of my town, and get out of my life." "Grace, sweetheart, you're being emotional." "I'm being clear," Grace interrupted. "I don't want your partnership, I don't want your money, and I don't want you. What we had is over. It was over the minute you left me standing at that altar." Marcus's confident expression finally began to crack. "You're really choosing this? This tiny town and that simple guy over everything I'm offering?" "I'm choosing happiness," Grace said firmly. "I'm choosing a life where I'm valued for who I am, not what I can do for someone else's image. I'm choosing love." Before Marcus could respond, the door chimed and Nathan walked in with Sophia, just as they did every morning. Grace's heart sank as she realized they were about to witness whatever ugly scene Marcus was planning to create. "Daddy, it's the man who made Grace sad," Sophia announced with the tactless honesty of a 6-year-old. Marcus turned to look at Nathan with obvious disdain, taking in his simple work clothes and weathered hands. "So you're the competition," he said with a smirk. Nathan's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "I'm Nathan Brooks. And you're the man who hurt Grace." "I'm the man who's trying to save her from making a terrible mistake," Marcus corrected. "Grace is too talented for this place. She belongs in the city, with people who can appreciate her abilities." "Grace belongs wherever she chooses to be," Nathan said quietly, but there was steel in his voice. "And it sounds like she's already made her choice." Marcus laughed, a cold sound that made several customers shift uncomfortably. "You really think you can compete with what I'm offering? I can give her everything: a successful business, financial security, a life of opportunities. What can you give her? A research scientist's salary and a ready-made family." Grace saw Nathan flinch at the words, saw doubt creep into his eyes, and she felt fury rise in her chest like a tide. "That's enough," Grace said, stepping out from behind the counter. "Marcus, you clearly don't understand anything about what makes a life worth living." "I understand that love doesn't pay bills," Marcus shot back. "I understand that in 10 years when the romance wears off, you'll regret giving up this opportunity." "You know what I regret?" Grace asked, her voice carrying clearly through the silent bakery. "I regret wasting 2 years of my life trying to be someone you could love instead of being myself." I regret thinking that your approval mattered more than my own happiness. She moved to stand beside Nathan, taking his hand in hers. But I don't regret moving here. I don't regret opening this bakery. And I certainly don't regret falling in love with Nathan and Sophia. Sophia beamed at the public declaration, and Nathan squeezed Grace's hand tightly. You're making a mistake, Marcus said, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. The only mistake I made was believing you when you said you loved me, Grace replied. Real love doesn't humiliate someone in public. Real love doesn't threaten to take away everything that makes them happy. Real love supports dreams instead of trying to control them. Marcus looked around the bakery at the faces watching him, clearly realizing that he'd lost his audience's sympathy entirely. Mrs. Chen was actually glaring at him, and one of the fishermen had stood up as if ready to escort Marcus out personally. Fine, Marcus said, his composure finally cracking completely. Enjoy your small life in your small town with your small dreams. But don't come crying to me when you realize what you've given up. He turned and stormed out of the bakery, leaving the roses and the business papers scattered on the counter. The door slammed behind him with enough force to rattle the windows. For a moment, the bakery remained completely silent. Then Mrs. Chen started clapping, slowly at first, then with enthusiasm that was quickly picked up by the other customers. Good for you, dear, Mrs. Chen called out. That man was a snake. Anyone who'd leave a woman like you at the altar doesn't deserve a second chance, added Tom Rodriguez, one of the fishermen. Grace felt tears prick her eyes, but this time they were tears of gratitude for these people who'd become her community, who'd stood witness to her declaration and offered their support. Thank you, she said to the room in general. All of you. As the customers gradually returned to their conversations and their breakfasts, Nathan turned to Grace with an expression of wonder and love that took her breath away. You meant all of that, he said softly. Every word, Grace confirmed. Nathan, I've never been more sure of anything in my life. This is where I belong. With you and Sophia in this town, building this life together. Nathan cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears she hadn't realized were falling. I love you, Grace Williams. More than I ever thought I could love anyone again. I love you too, Grace whispered. They might have kissed right there in front of everyone if Sophia hadn't tugged on Grace's apron. Grace, does this mean you're going to be my mommy now? Sophia asked with hopeful eyes. Grace knelt down to Sophia's level, her heart full to overflowing. Would you like that, sweetheart? More than anything, Sophia said, throwing her arms around Grace's neck. I've been wishing for a mommy, and I was hoping it would be you. As Grace held Sophia tight, feeling Nathan's hand warm on her shoulder, she realized that sometimes the best dreams were the ones you never knew you wanted until they came true. What would you do if someone from your past tried to steal your happiness? How far would you go to protect the family you'd chosen? Let us know in the comments and subscribe for more stories that will touch your heart. 1 year later, Grace stood on the beach at Seabrook Bay, wearing a simple white sundress and holding a bouquet of wildflowers that Sophia had helped her pick that morning. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, and the sound of waves provided the perfect soundtrack for the most important day of Grace's life. This time there was no church, no crowd of hundreds, no elaborate decorations. Just Grace, Nathan, Sophia, and 20 of their closest friends and neighbors gathered on the sand where Nathan had first shown Grace the sea turtle nesting sites. Pastor Williams from the local community church, no relation despite the shared name, stood before them with a warm smile, his words simple and heartfelt as he spoke about love, commitment, and the families we choose for ourselves. Grace, Nathan said when it was time for vows, his voice steady but his eyes bright with emotion. A year ago, I thought my chance for happiness had ended. I was wrong. You brought light back into our lives, showed me that love doesn't replace what we've lost but adds something new and beautiful alongside it. Grace felt tears slide down her cheeks as Nathan continued. You chose us when you could have chosen a bigger life, an easier path. You chose to love a grieving widower and his daughter, to build something real in a small town by the sea. Today I choose you, Grace. I choose our life together, our dreams together, our family together. When it was Grace's turn, she looked out at the small group of people who'd become her world. Mrs. Chin dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Tom Rodriguez stood with his arm around his wife, both of them beaming. Dr. Kim had driven down from the research station with several of Nathan's colleagues. Nathan, Grace began, her voice thick with emotion, I came to Seabrook Bay running from a broken heart and a shattered dream. I thought I was starting over, but really I was starting for the first time. You and Sophia taught me what real love looks like, patient and kind and strong enough to weather any storm. She looked down at Sophia, who was practically vibrating with excitement in her purple flower girl dress. "I promise to love you both, to protect this family we've built, and to never take for granted the miracle of being exactly where I belong. You are my home, my future, and my greatest joy." When Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up from their small crowd could probably be heard all the way back in town. Nathan's kiss was soft and sweet and full of promise, and when they broke apart, Sophia was jumping up and down with excitement. "Can I call you Mommy now?" Sophia asked as soon as the ceremony was over. "You can call me whatever feels right to you, sweetheart," Grace replied, kneeling down to Sophia's level in her wedding dress. "Mommy Grace," Sophia decided, throwing her arms around Grace's neck. "My very own Mommy Grace." The reception was held right there on the beach, with string lights hung between driftwood posts and tables covered with white linens that fluttered in the ocean breeze. Grace's wedding cake was a work of art, 3 tiers decorated with sugar flowers and sea glass, created in her own bakery kitchen with help from Jamie and half the town. As the evening progressed, Grace found herself marveling at how perfect everything felt. Not perfect in the planned, controlled way her first wedding was supposed to be, but perfect in its simplicity and authenticity. Every person there genuinely loved and supported them. Every detail reflected who they really were as a couple and a family. "Any regrets?" Nathan asked as they swayed together during their first dance, Sophia spinning around them in her purple dress. "Only one," Grace replied, and Nathan's eyebrows rose in concern. "What's that?" "I regret that it took me so long to find you," Grace said, and Nathan's smile could have powered the whole town. Later, as the party wound down and guests began to head home, Sophia approached Grace with a carefully wrapped package. "This is for you," Sophia said, suddenly shy. "I made it myself." Grace opened the gift to find a photo album, each page decorated with Sophia's artwork and filled with pictures from their year together. The first page showed a photo Nathan had taken of Grace and Sophia making cookies, both of them covered in flour and laughing. Sophia had drawn hearts and flowers around the border and written in her careful first-grade handwriting, "The day I found my new mommy." "Sophia, this is beautiful," Grace said, her voice thick with tears. "This is the most wonderful gift anyone has ever given me." "Look at the last page," Sophia instructed. Grace flipped to the end of the album, where Sophia had glued a photo from today's ceremony, showing the 3 of them holding hands on the beach. Below it, in purple crayon, Sophia had written, "My real family." Grace had to sit down, overwhelmed by the simple perfection of it all. This little girl who'd wandered into her bakery in a yellow raincoat had given her everything she'd never even known she wanted. "Are you crying because you're happy or because you're sad?" Sophia asked, concerned by Grace's tears. "Happy," Grace managed. "The happiest I've ever been in my whole life." As the last guests departed and they cleaned up the remnants of the celebration, Grace found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her here. The devastating betrayal that had sent her running from her old life now seemed like a blessing in disguise. If Marcus hadn't left her at the altar, she never would have come to Seabrook Bay. She never would have met Nathan and Sophia. She never would have discovered what real love felt like. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Brooks?" Nathan asked, appearing beside her with Sophia sleeping in his arms. "Mrs. Brooks." Grace felt a thrill at the name, at the identity that came with it. Not just Nathan's wife, but Sophia's mother, a member of this little family unit that had somehow become more than the sum of its parts. "More than ready," Grace replied. As they walked back toward their car, Nathan carrying Sophia and Grace holding her wedding bouquet and the precious photo album, Grace caught sight of Sweet Dreams Bakery in the distance. Tomorrow she'd be back to work, creating beautiful things for the people of Seabrook Bay. But tonight, she was simply Grace Brooks, surrounded by the love of her family and the promise of all the tomorrows they'd share together. 6 months after the wedding, Grace stood in her bakery kitchen putting the finishing touches on a birthday cake for Luna, the sea turtle who'd finally been released back to the ocean. The research station was throwing a celebration, and Grace had volunteered to make a cake shaped like a sea turtle, complete with blue and green icing and edible sea glass decorations. "It's perfect," Sophia announced from her perch on the step stool, where she was carefully arranging sugar flowers around the base of the cake. "Almost perfect," Grace corrected, adding one final detail, a small sugar turtle swimming alongside the larger one. "There. Now it's perfect." The bell above the bakery door chimed, and Grace looked up to see Nathan entering with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Good timing," Grace said, stepping back to admire their handiwork. "We just finished Luna's cake." "Actually," Nathan said, his voice strange, "I have something else to celebrate." Grace looked at him more closely, noticing the envelope in his hands and the way he was practically vibrating with energy. "What's going on?" she asked. "Tell her, Daddy," Sophia urged, clearly already in on whatever secret Nathan was keeping. Nathan handed Grace the envelope with shaking hands. "The Research Foundation approved our grant application. Full funding for a 5-year study of sea turtle conservation, with enough budget to hire additional researchers and expand the education programs." Grace stared at the letter, reading the amount of the grant award twice to make sure she wasn't imagining the number of zeros. "Nathan, this is incredible," she breathed. "This is everything you've been working toward." "It gets better," Nathan said, his grin spreading even wider. "Part of the grant includes funding for community education initiatives. Cooking classes that teach sustainable seafood practices, educational workshops about marine conservation." Grace looked up from the letter, understanding beginning to dawn. "You want me to be part of the program?" "I want us to be partners," Nathan said. "Your bakery as a community education center, teaching people about sustainable living while they learn to bake. Combining your talents with the research mission." Grace felt excitement bubble up in her chest. "We could do kids' programs teaching them about ocean conservation while they decorate cookies shaped like sea creatures." "Exactly," Nathan said. "Grace, this could put Seabrook Bay on the map as a model for community-based conservation education." "And I could help," Sophia added importantly. "I know all about sea turtles and I'm really good at decorating cookies." Grace looked between Nathan and Sophia, these two people who'd changed her life in ways she could never have imagined. A year and a half ago she'd been standing in a wedding dress, watching her carefully planned life crumble around her. Now she was building something bigger and more meaningful than anything she could have planned. "When do we start?" Grace asked. Nathan's answer was to sweep her into a kiss that tasted like salt air and possibility, while Sophia cheered and the afternoon sun streamed through the windows of Sweet Dreams Bakery, illuminating the life Grace had never dared to dream she could have. That evening, as they sat on their back porch watching the sunset paint the ocean in brilliant colors, Sophia curled up between Grace and Nathan with a book about marine life. Grace reflected on the unexpected paths that had led her here. She'd thought she wanted the fairy tale wedding, the perfect husband, the life that looked impressive from the outside. Instead, she'd found something infinitely better. A real marriage built on mutual respect and shared dreams, a daughter who loved her unconditionally, and work that felt like purpose rather than just profit. "Grace." Sophia's voice interrupted her thoughts. "Yes, sweetheart?" "I'm glad the mean man left you at the altar," Sophia said with the blunt honesty that Grace had come to love. "Because if he hadn't, you wouldn't have come here and we wouldn't be a family." Grace felt Nathan's hand squeeze hers as she smiled down at their daughter. "You know what, Sophia? I'm glad to. Because this is exactly where I was always supposed to be." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky and the sound of waves provided the soundtrack to their quiet family evening, Grace knew with absolute certainty that she was home.